right, so we're going to take a look at Margaret Atwood for the final piece of our lecture here. And she's, as it says, Canada's best known writer. Canada's colonial relationship with Britain was very different from the other ones we've talked about and lacked the same degree of violence. But nonetheless, as one's part of the British Empire, Canadian literature is important to our study here, and Atwood does directly address Canadian identity and the Canadian condition. So that's just one aspect of what we'll look at in her writing, because she's a very diverse, very interesting, really wonderful writing. I'm glad we'll end this lesson with. She was born in Canada and spent a large part of every year in the wildernesses of Quebec and Ontario. Her father was a forest entomologist, and he pursued his research on insects while she immersed herself in woods and books. She's the author of more than a dozen collections of poetry, but best known for her fiction. She's written a ton of poetry. It's really very interesting and good. But she's written about a dozen novels, I think, and those are really what have made her famous, although her poetry is good and well worth studying. Her most famous novel is The Handmaid's Tale. And many of you are probably familiar with this. It's considered one of the best novels of the 20th century, one of the best science fiction novels ever written, but it's science fiction with a clear message or purpose beyond just to entertain. And it depicts a dystopian future where women are essentially slaves for reproductive purposes. And so it's considered not just a landmark novel or landmark work of science fiction, but also a landmark statement in the history of the development of feminism, especially through literature. There was recently a TV series developed out of it for Hulu. I haven't seen that, but it's a terrific read. It's a quick read, very exciting as well as engaging, so you should pick it up and check it out. It's kind of shocking she didn't win the Booker Prize for it, but in 2000 she won the Booker Prize for The Blind Assassin, which is more of a historical novel about Canadian politics and espionage, and also a very good novel, but not as much of a powerhouse, in my opinion, as The Handmaid's Tale. She's helped bring attention to and shape Canadian literature. As I said, she's the most famous writer from Canada, so she's definitely helped put Canadian literature on the map. And the way she describes Canadian literature is she states, "Our stories are likely to be tales not of those of who made it, but of those who made it back. The survivor has no triumph or victory, but the fact of his survival." So here she's contrasting Canadian literature with American and British literature, which American literature is often about the frontier and conquering it, so those who made it. And then British literature is, you say, more genteel and not about the frontier. Canada has the wild wilderness and difficult climates and temperatures, so it's certainly on the frontier, but it's more of a story of survival rather than conquering, the Canadian story. So the term we're going to use to describe Canadian literature throughout this lesson is Canadian survivor stories, and we're going to see what that means and how Atwood works with that in her short story we have here. So what are the things we're going to be looking at? Environmentalism. Atwood is a very pro-environment writer, and that comes through in many of her works. And there's, I would argue, a disconnect between the protagonist and nature in this work. And growing up in Canada, you're just kind of enmeshed in it, growing up in those wildernesses, like she says. So you can't really get out of discussing the natural world when you're reading Canadian literature. Guilt. If you've read this story, it's clearly a big theme. The judgment of others, that has to do with the twist that comes in the story toward the end. Connected to the first point here, as I just mentioned, the danger and mystery of the wilderness is a big part of it. The power of storytelling. I think ultimately, when you get to the end of this story, Death by Landscape, what it's really about, what its central focus is the power of storytelling. And the textbook says for Atwood it can be both crippling and liberating. So we'll also look at what exactly that means. Now, I want to say something about these last two bullet points here. If there's two things Atwood is known for, it's feminism and then representing Canadian literature. But if you read interviews with her, she's a great interviewer. She's very witty and fun, clever, but she doesn't like to talk about these two things openly. She clearly stands up for and fights for um, equality among the genders and better rights for women, as The Handmaid's Tale indicates. But she doesn't like to be labeled or called a feminist. She doesn't like labels. She wants to write the literature and let the literature speak, which I think is really great because she has a clear, important message, but she first and foremost tells a great story. And I think that's what makes her literature powerful. So I think it's kind of good that she doesn't like labels. But ironically, everyone loves to label her as a feminist and a Canadian writer. So we're going to look very closely at these two things, but um, just wanted you to know how she views being labeled that way. Um, so the way I think this story addresses feminism is through female friendship. This story is all about the relationship between two women, and they're not just talking about men or anything like that. They're talking about things that matter to them, and so that's really unique. That actually doesn't happen a lot in literature, where you have a vivid portrayal of a female friendship, just two females connecting just as friends. Um, Not talking about men, that's very rare. And so that's a really cool, unique thing we have here. The other is that this is one of those Canadian survivor stories and is thus representative of Canadian literature. So we'll also talk about that. We'll first look at two quotes from the opening. What you have here is kind of a frame narrative. You have this woman who's older. Her husband is dead. Her children are moved out. She's in the latter stages, the twilight of her life. And so you have an introduction that establishes that, but then something's clearly wrong, something's clearly off. So then, smack dab in the middle of the story, you have this long narrative that explains what happened that affected her. And then it closes with a return to the present, and you see now how and why those events from the past affected her and shaped the woman we're introduced to at the start of the story. So all the quotes are actually going to come from the frame, from those opening and closing parts of the story. The narrative in the middle is obviously very important to establishing the things we'll talk about, but the most poignant language to really getting at the meaning of the story, I believe, is in those opening and closing framing passages. So at the beginning, the narrator tells us that Lois is relieved not to have to worry about the lawn or about the ivy pushing its muscular little suckers into the brickwork, or the squirrels gnawing their way into the attic and eating the insulation off the wiring, or about strange noises. The building has a security system, and the only plant life is in pots in the solarium. So at this point in her life, Lois has set up a life for herself that is not very demanding. She lives in this condo where the yard, all of that stuff is basically taken care of for her. So she she needs a life that's not very demanding at this point. Um, it obviously establishes a disconnect between Lois and the natural world. All of the home maintenance things to which this passage refers are all ones that have to do with nature in the yard and whatnot. So she's disconnected from nature. She doesn't want to be enmeshed in nature. So what I was really doing here is engaging us as readers. Why is Lois this way? What has caused her to want to live this type of life? We want to know. That's why we're going to read the narrative that is in the middle of the story, but takes up the bulk of the story. There's one other passage I think that's really important to look at for framing the story. She bought the paintings because she wanted them. She wanted something that was in them, although she could not have said at the time what it was. It was not peace. She does not find them peaceful in the least. Looking at them fills her with a wordless unease. Despite the fact that there are no people in them or even animals, it's as if there is something or someone looking back out. So these are the paintings she's collected and hung up on the walls. Atwood uses them to further build and engage an interest and wonder what has happened. Um, we know that this is not normal. Her reasons, at least, for having the paintings. Having the paintings would be normal, but her reasons are different. Something is odd or out of place here. So we really want to know what has happened. What has happened to her that's caused her to hang up all these pictures? Why are they specifically of landscapes? The footnote tells us they're by some of the most famous Canadian painters, but they're all of landscapes. That's important. Landscapes with no people or animals in them. Significant, but it's as if there is something or someone looking back out. So if you've read the whole story, we know this is Lucy, the person who's in them looking back out. Um, but let's see what happens at the end of the story. So if you've read it, you know, in the main narrative, it's about when Lois was a young girl, a young teenager at summer camp. She had this best friend, Lucy. They have kind of a complicated relationship, and um, there's a really great development there on what's part of the female friendship between these two girls. But um, what's really important is Lucy's disappearance. If we had time, we'd look at some of those passages about building their friendship. But what it comes down to is one day the two of them are off by themselves on this canoe trip they're taking, and they both have to go to the bathroom. And Lois starts to walk away while Lucy's going to the bathroom. And then she hears a noise, but Lucy's gone. And so this haunts her forever, and that's what has happened. So, what is the effect of on Lois, and how is Atwood using this to tell the story she wants to tell? One significant thing is the interaction Lois has with Cappy, who is the woman who is the leader of this camp, the adult who's the leader of it. And Cappy basically casts the blame on Lois, and Lois comes to understand why. Later, when she was grown up, Lois was able to understand what this interview had been about. She could see Cappy's desperation, her need for a story, a real story with a reason in it, anything but the senseless vacancy Lucy had left for her to deal with. She wanted Lois to supply the reason, to be the reason. It wasn't even for the newspapers or the parents, because she could never make such an accusation without proof. It was for herself, something to explain the loss of Camp Manitou and of all she had worked for. The years of entertaining spoiled children and buttering up parents and making a fool of herself with feathers stuck in her hair. Camp Manitou was, in fact, lost. It did not survive. So obviously, a kid disappears, the camp is going to be closed down, either officially closed down or due to lack of people coming to it anymore, because a kid disappeared on their watch and was never found. Um, but Camp Manitou was Cappy's passion in life's work, so she has to justify this, even if not to the parents, or the authorities, at least to herself. And so to do that, she blames Lois for Lucy's disappearance, even though it's really, not Lois's fault. And so you have this conversation that directly precedes this quote, where Cappy is just an adult interacting with a teenager, rhetorically manipulates the conversation and clearly casts the blame on Lois, and it penetrates Lois. She feels that. She buys to a certain extent what Cappy is saying, and she feels this guilt. And so it's not just Lucy's disappearance, it's the guilt. That is what haunts Lois forever. Um, Lois worked all this out 20 years later, but it was far too late. It was too late even 10 minutes afterwards. When she'd left Cappy's office and was walking slowly back to her cabin to pack, Lucy's clothes were still there, folded on the shelves as if waiting. She felt the other girls in the cabin watching her, with speculation in their eyes. Could she have done it? She must have done it. For the rest of her life, she has caught people watching her in this way. So she obviously feels enormous guilt over what happened to Lucy, but it's not um, just the guilt from Cappy. She said even if she'd realized 10 minutes afterwards that Cappy was manipulating her, it wouldn't have mattered. The moment Lucy was gone, that's all it took for Lois to be haunted forever. So what Cappy is doing is just one example of the guilt she feels, but she feels these others judging and watching her, and she'll always feel that. It's kind of a paranoia. They're probably not, maybe some are, they're probably not thinking about her that way, but she's always going to feel that way because she feels that guilt herself internally. So this Lucy's disappearance and moreover the guilt um, are the experiences that have shaped Lucy's life. Lois's life. We now know why she acts the way she does, why she feels the way she does at the start of the story. So here are some quotes from the end of it. She can hardly remember now having her two boys in the hospital, nursing them as babies. She can hardly remember getting married or what Rob looked like. Even at the time, she never felt she was paying full attention. She was tired a lot, as if she was living not one life but two, her own and another shadowy life that hovered around her and would not let itself be realized. The life of what would have happened if Lucy had not stepped sideways and disappeared from time. So her life essentially hits pause. From that moment on, not even 10 minutes after Lucy's disappearance, as soon as she knows she's gone and can't get her back, can't find her, her life hits pause. She's walking through the world numb. She has a husband, she has two children. She doesn't feel any of that because she's so consumed by guilt and the loss of her friend. Furthermore, on another point, the language surrounding Lucy's disappearance is intentionally vague. Um, we don't know what happened to Lucy. She could have run away or something and still be alive somewhere. The most logical conclusion is that she's dead, but we don't know that for sure. But this language, what would have happened if Lucy had not stepped sideways and disappeared from time? This is part of Lois's way of coping with this. It's a third person narration, but in these lines, we almost feel like Lois is writing the story. It's um, it's a third person narration inflected, at least at this point, by Lois's view. She can't accept the reality that Lucy's most likely or probably dead, at least could be dead. And so the language here is really indicative of Lois's state of mind. Finally, one final point on this poignant passage. The loss of her childhood female friend overshadows the master narrative of domesticity. So Lois has what would be a very normal life here. She gets married, has a couple kids, retires, etc. Um, but that's minimal. That's like a side note to just kind of establish background. What's most important here is the female friendship and the loss of that. So this to me is where you have kind of a feminist thrust to the story. Um, the final two paragraphs we're going to read aloud here, and then on the final slide we'll look at their significance as well as the overall things we've learned from this story. She looks at the paintings. She looks into them. Every one of them is a picture of Lucy. You can't see her exactly, but she's there. And behind the pink stone island or the one behind that. In the picture of the cliff, she is hidden by the clutch of fallen rocks toward the bottom. In the one of the river's shore, she is crouching beneath the overturned canoe. In the yellow autumn wood, she's behind the tree that cannot be seen because of the other trees. Over beside the blue sliver of pond, but if you walked into the picture and found the tree, it would be the wrong one, because the right one would be farther on. Everyone has to be somewhere, and this is where Lucy is. She is in Lois's apartment, and the holes that open inward on the wall, not like windows, but like doors. She is here. She is entirely alive. So what do these passages tell us? Three major themes come out of this story that I think you can really see in those final two paragraphs. The power of storytelling. Lois authors Lucy's presence into the paintings. They're empty landscapes. Lucy disappeared in the Canadian wilderness. So by buying pictures with empty landscapes, Lois is able to put Lucy into the pictures. Believes she is there, believes she's out there somewhere. And so literature is both crippling and liberating. You have here the power of storytelling because characters take over the story and hijack it from the omniscient narrator, from from the omniscient narrator, from the author, really. Even Cappy does that, where she makes the disappearance seem to be Lois's fault. And it even says she needed a story, is the language used there in Cappy's office. Here, Lois is doing something similar. She's taking over the story and putting Lucy into these pictures with empty landscapes. And so, what Cappy does when she authors the story is crippling. But what Lois does is liberating, because um, she's able to believe, kind of keep her hope alive, that her friend is still out there somewhere, and that's all she can really do to survive. Um, Lois suffers from an inability to live life to the fullest. Her memories of her husband and children are a blur, but her memories of her childhood with this friend who disappeared are as vivid as ever. And so, how does she survive? How does she go on day by day? Oh, oh, sorry, what I mean here is this is how she survives. This is the Canadian survivor story. She's gone through the wilderness and lost her friend, and the guilt over it has haunted her forever. And the only way she can go on day by day is by believing her friend's still out there, and by becoming the author of the story, and using the landscape pictures to do that. That's how she survives. Finally, the connection to nature. Um, the Canadian wilderness defines Canadian experience in literature for Atwood. Lucy is lost in the wild, mysterious forest, but Lois has authored her back into the paintings that are specifically landscape paintings. And so, in a way, Lois has incorporated the wilderness, embraced the wilderness back into her life, because these are paintings of the Canadian wilderness, of the Canadian landscape. And she's authored a story into them, so she's connected to them. But I'm not sure. I think the story has a lot of unanswered questions, and that's what I'm going to leave with you. I would have put them on the slide if I'd had more room. I don't think we see, I think we see a somewhat of connection to the wilderness, somewhat of an embracing of the wilderness through these paintings at the end, but it seems like there's still a disconnect from nature. It's not like this is a completely redemptive story and the paintings just completely free Lois from all of the guilt. They help her survive, but I think that's Atwood's point, right? It's not stories of those who have made it, it's stories of those who have made it back. So Lois is not triumphant, but she's a survivor. And for Atwood, that's the Canadian story. So maybe the ending's supposed to be ambiguous. But I wonder, what I'm wondering of you that you could answer in your discussion board posts or your papers is, how strong is the connection, potential reconnection to nature here at the end? Also, something I ran out of room here for is the title. I think the title is really interesting. Death by Landscape. These are landscape paintings. Um, did Lucy die? I think Atwood wants us that to be ambiguous, but if she wants it to be ambiguous, why is the title Death by Landscape? Lucy could have easily been killed by the wilderness, and then the title would make sense. Or is the title more about what Lois is doing with the paintings? Is she using the landscape paintings to kill the guilt, kill the memory that's haunting her? I don't know. I think these are questions I'd love to hear you answer. I think really the question that's asked by both the connection to nature and both the title is how redemptive is this story? How free from burden and guilt is Lois at the end, if at all? So really interesting story. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to reading what you think of it.